3 in the morning. The room is dark, the house is quiet, and you are awake again. Not groggy, not half asleep. Fully awake, eyes open, mind turning, with no obvious reason for it. You check the clock, 3:14. You close your eyes. An hour passes, maybe more, and eventually sleep returns, or it doesn't, and the alarm goes off and you start the day already behind. You have been telling yourself it is stress, a busy mind, too much coffee, getting older, and maybe one of those things is true. But here is what almost nobody considers when this pattern repeats night after night, week after week, month after month, without a clear explanation. The body does not wake you up at random. It wakes you up because something is happening, because a system is activated that should not be activated at 3 a.m., because an organ is working harder than it should be during the hours it was designed to rest, and the window between 2 and 4 a.m. is not arbitrary. It is the window that research has identified as the period when the body's internal systems reveal their stress most clearly, when compensatory mechanisms that hold things together during the day are at their lowest capacity, and when the signals the body has been suppressing become impossible to suppress any longer. A 2021 study published in the journal Sleep Medicine examined nocturnal awakening patterns in adults over 60 and correlated them with physiological markers measured during sleep studies. Adults who consistently woke between 2 and 4 a.m. showed significantly elevated cortisol at that hour, dysregulated blood sugar patterns, and in a substantial proportion, markers of cardiovascular and metabolic stress that had not appeared on their daytime clinical assessments. The wakings were not random. They were the surface expression of something happening underneath that the daytime tests were not catching. The 7 causes covered today are not the obvious ones, not the fold ladder or the outside noise. These are the internal physiological reasons that the 2 to 4 a.m. window specifically, consistently, and repeatedly pulls you out of sleep, and that most doctors have never connected to a sleep complaint because they are looking at the sleep and not at the system producing the waking. The 7th cause is the most commonly overlooked. The first is the one that specialists describe as the most urgent to address when it is the underlying driver. Because left unaddressed, it does not simply disrupt sleep. It accelerates the decline of the organ producing it in ways that accumulate silently while you lie awake staring at the ceiling. Before we begin, tell us in the comments right now, how old are you? Where are you watching from? And how many nights a week do you wake up between 2 and 4 a.m.? Drop it below. We read and respond to every single comment. Number 7. Blood sugar dropping or spiking during the night. Your blood sugar does not stay still while you sleep. It follows a pattern governed by the hormones of the overnight fasting period, by the composition of the last meal you ate, and by how effectively your body is managing glucose without any new food arriving. In adults whose blood sugar regulation is functioning well, this overnight pattern is smooth. Blood glucose falls gently from its post-dinner level to a stable overnight baseline and begins rising gradually in the early morning hours before waking as part of the body's preparation for the day. Sleep is undisturbed because the hormonal environment supporting this pattern is stable. In adults whose blood sugar regulation has become impaired, whether through early-stage insulin resistance, pre-diabetes, or fully established diabetes that is not yet optimally controlled, this overnight pattern develops irregularities. Blood sugar may drop too low in the early overnight hours, triggering the release of stress hormones, including cortisol and adrenaline, that raise it back up. These stress hormones are activating. They are designed to produce alertness and arousal. They wake you up. The 2 to 4 a.m. window is the most common time for this phenomenon because it corresponds to the peak of the overnight fasting period, when glucose reserves are lowest and the body's glucose-regulating mechanisms are under the most demand. Adults who wake consistently in this window and who experience sweating, a racing heart, hunger, or shakiness upon waking have a specific physiological pattern that points directly to a blood sugar regulatory issue that daytime fasting glucose tests frequently miss, because the problem manifests overnight when nothing is being measured. A study published in Diabetes Care followed adults with early insulin resistance using continuous glucose monitoring during sleep. In 64% of participants who reported consistent 2 to 4 a.m. awakenings, the monitoring revealed blood glucose patterns inconsistent with normal overnight regulation that had not appeared on their standard daytime laboratory assessments. The night was showing what the day was hiding. Number 6. Elevated cortisol from chronic stress disrupting the overnight recovery window. Cortisol follows a circadian rhythm. It is highest in the early morning, typically between 6 and 8 a.m., as part of the body's preparation for the demands of the waking day. It falls through the afternoon and reaches its lowest point in the early overnight hours, around midnight to 2 a.m., which is when the body is designed to be deepest in its recovery phase. In adults whose stress response has become chronically dysregulated, this cortisol pattern is disrupted. The overnight nadir, the low point that should allow the body to rest most deeply, is not as low as it should be. Cortisol remains elevated relative to its intended overnight level, and in many cases, it begins rising earlier than it should, spiking in the 2 to 4 a.m. window rather than waiting until the appropriate early morning rise. When cortisol rises in the middle of the night, everything it is designed to do in the morning happens at 3 a.m. instead. Blood pressure rises, heart rate increases, the brain activates. The body prepares for a day that is still 4 hours away. Sleep ends not because the body has rested adequately, but because the hormonal environment has shifted from recovery mode to arousal mode prematurely. Chronic cortisol dysregulation is not simply a stress problem in the psychological sense. It is a physiological condition with measurable consequences for cardiovascular health, immune function, metabolic regulation, and kidney function that compounds over months and years of disrupted, overnight cortisol patterns. A 2020 study published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism examined overnight cortisol profiles in adults over 60 with and without consistent nocturnal awakening. Those with consistent 2 to 4 a.m. awakenings showed cortisol levels at that hour that were 47% higher than those who slept through. The elevated cortisol was not a consequence of the waking. It was present before the waking occurred, measured by continuous sampling, indicating that the cortisol rise was causing the awakening rather than being caused by it. Before we continue, if this has been useful so far, hit that like button so more people can find this information. Subscribe and turn on notifications. New content every week. Number 5. Kidney function decline, disrupting overnight fluid and electrolyte balance. The kidneys follow a circadian rhythm of their own. During sleep, the filtration rate drops to its lowest daily level as part of the body's overnight recovery and conservation mode. Urine production decreases. The concentration of urine increases, and the body retains fluid and electrolytes that it will need for the demands of the waking day. When kidney function has declined, this circadian regulation is disrupted. The kidney's ability to concentrate urine efficiently during the overnight hours decreases. Larger volumes of more dilute urine are produced during the night to clear the same waste load. The result is nocturia, the need to urinate multiple times during the night, which is one of the most commonly reported symptoms in adults with early-stage kidney disease and one of the most consistently attributed to other causes, most frequently to fluid intake timing, to an enlarged prostate in men, or simply to aging. What distinguishes kidney-related nocturia from these other causes is its pattern and its accompaniments. Kidney-related nocturia typically produces urination 2 or more times per night, with urine that is pale and of larger volume than expected, given the overnight fluid restriction, indicating that the kidney is unable to concentrate appropriately. It is frequently accompanied by other subtle signs of kidney function decline, including persistent mild fatigue, mild ankle swelling in the evenings, and changes in daytime urination patterns. A study published in the American Journal of Kidney Diseases found that nocturia occurring 2 or more times nightly was associated with kidney function below the optimal range in 58% of adults over 60 who were evaluated, the majority of whom had no prior kidney diagnosis and whose standard daytime kidney function markers had not yet reached clinical threshold. The waking at 2 to 4 a.m. in this context is not the body waking you for no reason. The kidney that cannot concentrate overnight is producing urine that fills the bladder at a rate that interrupts sleep at its most vulnerable point. Number 4, acid reflux and gastroesophageal symptoms peaking in the overnight hours. The lower esophageal sphincter, the muscular valve that separates the stomach from the esophagus and prevents stomach acid from traveling upward, is at its lowest tone during sleep. This reduced tone is normal and is part of the general muscular relaxation that accompanies sleep. In adults whose lower esophageal sphincter function has been compromised by obesity, by hiatal hernia, by certain foods or medications, or simply by age-related changes in the musculature, this normal overnight reduction in sphincter tone allows acid to reflux into the esophagus at a frequency and volume that produces symptoms severe enough to cause waking. The 2 to 4 a.m. window is the most common time for symptomatic overnight reflux because it follows the period of peak gastric acid secretion that occurs approximately 2 to 3 hours after the last meal, and because it is the window in which the body is horizontal and sphincter tone is at its lowest. Adults who ate dinner at 7 p.m. and went to sleep at 10 p.m. will reach peak nocturnal acid reflux risk in the 12 a.m. to 3 a.m. window, depending on their gastric emptying rate. The connection between acid reflux and the 2 to 4 a.m. awakening is frequently not made by the person experiencing it, because overnight reflux does not always produce the classic heartburn sensation. It can present as a general sense of unease, a cough, a sensation of needing to clear the throat, or simply an unexplained arousal from sleep without any obvious gastric symptoms. The esophageal irritation is sufficient to trigger waking without being sufficient to produce the chest burning that would make the cause obvious. Number 3. Atrial fibrillation and cardiac arrhythmias occurring preferentially at night. The autonomic nervous system shifts its balance during sleep. The parasympathetic nervous system, which slows the heart and reduces blood pressure during rest, becomes more dominant during the overnight hours. This parasympathetic dominance is protective for the cardiovascular system under normal circumstances. In adults whose cardiac electrical system has developed areas of instability, this same parasympathetic shift can trigger arrhythmias that would not occur during the higher sympathetic tone of the waking day. Atrial fibrillation, the most common significant cardiac arrhythmia, shows a well-documented nocturnal pattern in many affected individuals. It initiates during sleep, particularly in the early overnight and pre-dawn hours, and it can produce awakening through several mechanisms. The sensation of an irregular heartbeat, palpitations that penetrate even deep sleep, breathlessness from the reduced cardiac efficiency of the arrhythmia, or the anxiety response that the heart's irregular beating triggers in the nervous system. What makes this particularly important is that paroxysmal atrial fibrillation, episodes that begin and end spontaneously, can be entirely asymptomatic in some adults and produce only the unexplained awakening in others. Adults who wake consistently in the 2 to 4 a.m. window and who experience any sensation of irregular heartbeat, racing pulse, chest discomfort, or breathlessness alongside the waking have grounds for a cardiac evaluation that includes a Holter monitor recording overnight heart rhythm, not merely a resting ECG taken during a daytime appointment. A study published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology found that nocturnal atrial fibrillation initiation was most common between midnight and 6 a.m., with the peak incidence in the 3 to 5 a.m. window, in adults who showed no evidence of arrhythmia on standard daytime ECG evaluation. The night was the window in which the electrical instability that the daytime tests missed became active. Number 2, liver function decline, and overnight metabolic processing stress. The liver performs its most intensive metabolic processing during the overnight fasting period. Glycogen breakdown, toxin clearance, protein synthesis, hormone processing, and the management of metabolic byproducts from the day's cellular activity all peak during the hours when the digestive system is at rest and the liver can redirect its resources away from processing incoming nutrients toward clearing the accumulated metabolic debt of the waking hours. When liver function is declining, this overnight processing creates a metabolic stress that the compromised liver handles less efficiently. Subclinical ammonia accumulation, the same mechanism described in the liver warning signs content, rises during the overnight processing period and crosses the blood-brain barrier at concentrations that activate the neural arousal systems. The brain is being mildly stimulated by metabolic byproducts that a fully functioning liver would have cleared before they reach the circulation in sufficient concentrations to affect brain chemistry. This mechanism is subtle enough that it does not produce the obvious confusion of hepatic encephalopathy. What it produces is a pattern of unexplained nocturnal awakening, often with a mild sense of restlessness or unease that the person cannot attribute to any specific sensation, occurring in the window when the liver's overnight processing burden is highest and its efficiency in handling that burden is lowest. Adults who wake in the 2 to 4 a.m. window and who have any of the liver warning signs described previously, including fatigue unresponsive to sleep, evening itching without a rash, or easy bruising, have grounds for a liver function evaluation that goes beyond enzyme levels to include the albumin, bilirubin, and prothrombin time markers that reflect actual liver synthetic and processing performance. Number 1. Sleep apnea causing repeated microarousals that cluster in the pre-dawn hours. This is the cause that explains the largest proportion of consistent 2 to 4 a.m. awakenings in adults over 60. And it is the one that most people have never connected to their sleep disruption because the arousals it produces do not always feel like what most people imagine a sleep apnea awakening should feel like. Sleep apnea causes breathing to stop repeatedly during sleep, from dozens to hundreds of times per night in severe cases. Each cessation of breathing triggers a partial arousal, a brief rising toward wakefulness sufficient to restore the muscle tone that reopens the airway, which then allows breathing to resume. These partial arousals are frequently not remembered. They do not always produce a full awakening, but they fragment the sleep architecture, reduce the proportion of restorative deep sleep, and leave the person exhausted upon a morning waking that felt to them like a full night of continuous sleep. The connection to the 2 to 4 a.m. window is specific and well documented. REM sleep, the sleep stage most associated with dreaming and with the muscular relaxation that makes the upper airway most vulnerable to collapse, is most concentrated in the last third of the overnight sleep period. For adults sleeping from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., REM sleep is most dense between 3 and 6 a.m. This is the window in which sleep apnea is most severe. Apnea events are most frequent, and the arousals are most likely to reach the threshold of full wakefulness. Adults with undiagnosed sleep apnea frequently describe their most disruptive awakenings as occurring consistently in the 3 to 5 a.m. window rather than throughout the night. Exactly the pattern the REM concentrated apnea mechanism would predict. A study published in the American Journal of Respiratory and Critical Care Medicine followed adults over 60 with consistent early morning awakenings through overnight sleep studies. Sleep apnea was identified as the primary cause of the awakening pattern in 67% of participants, the majority of whom had no prior sleep apnea diagnosis and had not reported snoring as a significant symptom to their physicians. The kidney consequences of untreated sleep apnea are described in detail in previous content. The cardiovascular consequences include elevated blood pressure, increased arrhythmia risk, and accelerated atherosclerosis. The metabolic consequences include insulin resistance and elevated inflammatory markers. And the cognitive consequences from the repeated nocturnal hypoxia and sleep fragmentation accumulate into measurable cognitive decline in adults who sleep through years of undiagnosed apnea, believing they simply do not sleep well. A 68-year-old woman came in reporting that she had been waking consistently between 3 and 4 a.m. for 2 years. She fell back asleep within an hour most nights, and her total sleep duration of 7 hours seemed adequate. She was exhausted every morning. She had been told her sleep was fine, her thyroid was fine, her blood tests were fine. An overnight sleep study identified severe obstructive sleep apnea with an apnea-hypopnea index of 34 events per hour, almost entirely concentrated in the REM-rich pre-dawn hours that corresponded exactly to her consistent awakening window. After CPAP treatment, her morning awakenings resolved within 2 weeks. Her morning fatigue, which she had been managing for 2 years, resolved within a month. The 2 to 4 a.m. window is not a mystery. It is a diagnostic window. Your body is not waking you arbitrarily. It is waking you because something in its internal physiology has reached a stress point that sleep cannot contain. The 7 causes in this video are the most common physiological drivers of that specific window, and each of them has an identifiable mechanism, a testable marker, and an addressable intervention that most people never pursue because nobody told them that the awakening was worth investigating rather than simply enduring. Now, we want to hear from you. How many nights a week do you wake up in this window? And how long has this pattern been happening? Share in the comments below. We respond to every single one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Next week, we are covering the 9 signs in your hands that your cardiovascular system has been declining for years without producing any symptoms anywhere else.